"You don't belong at this table." The words landed clean, sharp, deliberate, but they weren't the thing that changed the room. Not yet. It was the silence that followed, the kind of silence that stretched just long enough for everyone nearby to notice something was off, just long enough for eyes to shift, glasses to pause midair, conversations to thin out into low murmurs. And then came the movement, subtle at first, a wrist tilting, a crystal glass lifting just slightly higher than necessary, and then the slow, careless spill of deep red wine cascading forward, soaking into the front of a charcoal shirt like ink spreading across paper, deliberate enough to be noticed, casual enough to be denied. And when it happened, a few people laughed, not loudly, not boldly, but just enough to signal agreement, just enough to reinforce what had already been decided about the man sitting there. Darius Cole didn't flinch. Not when the wine touched his chest, not when it began to drip downward, not when the room decided in that instant who he was supposed to be. He sat exactly as he had before, shoulders relaxed, posture grounded, as if the chair beneath him belonged to him in a way no one else could see. The room itself was built for power, a private investor gala held on the 42nd floor of a glass-wrapped tower overlooking downtown Manhattan, the kind of place where deals didn't just happen, they shaped industries, where one handshake could move hundreds of millions, where names mattered more than introductions, where presence alone was supposed to say everything. And yet somehow Darius had entered without triggering any of the usual signals. No assistant trailing behind him, no designer label announcing his worth, no watch flashing under the lights, just a plain black jacket, a simple shirt now stained with red, and an expression that didn't match the role everyone had already assigned him. Ethan Whitmore leaned back slightly, glass still in hand, the faintest smile pulling at the edge of his mouth, the kind of smile that wasn't about humor. It was about permission, permission to belittle, permission to dismiss, permission granted by a lifetime of never being questioned. "Now you match the carpet," he said, low enough that it felt private, loud enough that the table heard it anyway. A few heads turned. A woman across the table covered her mouth, not in shock, but in something closer to discomfort she didn't plan to act on. A man to Darius's left shifted in his seat, but said nothing. No one reached for a napkin. No one apologized. No one corrected the moment, because the room had already decided that this was acceptable, that whatever had just happened was justified by who they believed Darius to be. And Darius, still unmoving, lowered his eyes not in submission but in observation, watching the wine as it spread across the fabric, watching how it absorbed, how it changed shape, how something that looked like damage might not actually be damage at all, because he had seen this before, not the exact moment, not this exact room, but the pattern, the quiet decisions made by people who thought they could measure worth by surface, by appearance, by proximity to power instead of ownership of it. And somewhere behind him a phone lifted slightly, not fully raised, not openly recording, but hovering in that space between curiosity and caution, because even those who didn't speak could feel that something about this moment didn't sit right. A junior analyst near the edge of the room glanced down at a digital guest list on her tablet, her brow tightening as she scrolled, her finger pausing on a name she wasn't expecting to see. But she didn't say anything. Not yet. Not while the energy still belonged to someone else. Ethan set his glass down with a soft click against the table, leaning forward now, emboldened by the lack of resistance. "You should probably step away before security gets involved," he added, voice carrying just a little further this time, enough for nearby tables to pick up the shift. And still, Darius didn't respond, didn't wipe the wine, didn't look up immediately, and that lack of reaction began to do something strange to the room, because it removed the expected script. It denied the satisfaction of escalation. It turned what should have been a quick dismissal into something that lingered, something that stretched, something that made people wonder why he wasn't reacting the way someone in his position was supposed to react. A server passed by, hesitated for half a second, then kept walking, unsure whether to intervene, unsure whether this was a situation or simply part of the unspoken rules that govern spaces like this. And the skyline outside the windows reflected back into the glass, lights flickering like distant signals. While inside, the tension thickened, not loud, not explosive, but precise, controlled, and building. Darius finally lifted his gaze, not toward Ethan at first, but toward the center of the table, scanning faces, reading expressions, cataloging reactions, because this wasn't just about one man and one glass of wine. It was about a room full of people making a collective decision, and he was taking note of every single one of them. The ones who laughed, the ones who stayed silent, the ones who looked away, the ones who leaned in, and when his eyes finally met Ethan's, there was no anger there, no embarrassment, no urgency, just a steady, unreadable calm that didn't match the situation at all, and that, more than anything, caused the first crack in Ethan's confidence, because this wasn't how it was supposed to go. The man in front of him wasn't shrinking, wasn't apologizing, wasn't leaving. He was sitting there as if the moment hadn't taken anything from him at all, as if the room had miscalculated something critical. A subtle vibration pulsed through the table as a phone somewhere nearby lit up, unnoticed by most, but not by Darius, who shifted his hand slightly, fingers brushing against his own device, still resting face down beside his plate. He didn't reach for it immediately, didn't rush, because timing mattered more than reaction, because in rooms like this, power wasn't about volume, it was about sequence, about knowing exactly when to move and when to let others keep talking, keep revealing, keep digging, and around him the whispers began to form, small at first, then growing. "Who is he?" someone asked quietly. "Why is he still sitting there?" Another replied, and the junior analyst in the back took a step forward, hesitated again, then stopped, caught between what she knew and what she was afraid to interrupt. Ethan straightened slightly, misreading the silence as hesitation rather than control. "I'm serious," he said, tone tightening just a fraction. "This isn't your kind of event." And there it was, the line that wasn't about wine, wasn't about seating, wasn't about etiquette, it was about assumption, about drawing a boundary that didn't actually exist. And for the first time, Darius moved, not dramatically, not abruptly, just a simple, deliberate motion as he reached for his phone, turning it over, the screen lighting up softly in his hand, his thumb hovering for a brief second before tapping once, a single action, almost invisible, almost insignificant, and then he set the phone back down, face up this time, and returned his attention to Ethan. The room didn't notice the message, didn't understand the shift that had just occurred, but something had changed, something quiet, something irreversible. And Darius leaned back slightly in his chair, the faintest hint of a smile not on his lips, but in the steadiness of his presence. And in that moment, the man they had just tried to remove from the table looked more anchored than anyone else in the room, as if he hadn't been the one out of place at all, as if the mistake belonged entirely to them. The room did not recover. It recalibrated slowly, awkwardly, like a machine that had just received the wrong input and did not know how to process it. Conversations tried to restart, but they came back thinner, weaker. Eyes no longer stayed locked on their own circles. They drifted back, toward Darius, toward the man who still had not moved to clean himself up, still had not raised his voice, still had not done anything that matched the reaction they expected from someone in his position. And that mismatch began to press on the edges of the room like pressure building behind glass. Ethan noticed it too, even if he did not fully understand it. His fingers tapped once against the table, a small, restless motion that betrayed something new, not doubt, not yet, but awareness that the moment had not ended the way he had intended. "You are still here," he said, this time louder. Not a question, but a statement that demanded agreement from the room, but no one answered immediately, and that silence no longer felt like support. It felt like distance, like the room was stepping half an inch away from him, without moving at all. A man 2 seats down cleared his throat and reached for his drink, but missed the glass slightly, his focus no longer where it should have been. The junior analyst in the back looked down again at her tablet, her thumb scrolling faster, now stopping again on the same name, Darius Cole, her eyes widening just slightly as more information populated across the screen. Acquisition records, board affiliations, controlling interest numbers she did not expect to see connected to a name sitting quietly at a table that had just dismissed him. She looked up, her gaze snapping toward him, then toward Ethan, then back again, her lips parting as if to speak, but nothing came out, because timing in rooms like this was not about truth, it was about survival, and she had not yet decided which one mattered more. The skyline outside flickered as a passing reflection shifted across the glass, and for a moment the entire room seemed suspended between two versions of itself, one that had already judged and one that was beginning to question. Darius shifted his hand slightly, resting it on the table, near his phone, not gripping it, not hiding, it's simply placing it where it could be seen, and that small gesture carried more weight than any raised voice could have because it suggested readiness, without urgency, control, without display. Ethan leaned forward again, trying to reclaim the center of the moment. "You think staying quiet makes this go away?" he said, his tone tightening just enough to reveal the strain beneath it, because now the silence was no longer serving him, it was exposing him. Darius met his gaze fully this time, and when he spoke his voice was calm, even almost conversational. "It does not go away," he said. "It settles," and the words did not sound like a warning. They sounded like a fact, something already decided, something already in motion. A woman at the far end of the table shifted in her seat, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she was beginning to piece together something that did not align with what she had first assumed. And beside her another guest leaned closer, whispering, "Do you know who he is?" And she shook her head, but did not look away. The room was no longer ignoring him, it was studying him. Ethan let out a short breath, something between a laugh and a dismissal, but it did not land the way it had before, because the room did not follow it this time. No echo, no quiet agreement, just a pause that stretched longer than it should have, and in that pause a phone buzzed softly, then another, small vibrations rippling across the table like a chain reaction, subtle but undeniable. Darius did not look down. He did not need to, because he already knew what had been set in motion, but others did look. One man glanced at his screen, his expression shifting almost instantly from casual distraction to focused concern, his posture straightening as he read again, then again, as if confirming what he was seeing across the table. Another guest checked his phone, his brows pulling together, the same pattern, repeating message by message, screen by screen, information moving faster than conversation could keep up with. The junior analyst took a step forward, this time unable to stay still any longer, her voice low, uncertain, but present. "Excuse me," she said, not addressing Ethan, not addressing the room directly, but aiming the words toward the space between them. "I think there might be a mistake." Ethan turned toward her, irritation flashing across his face. "Not now," he said, dismissive but sharper than before. "Sit down." But she did not move, her eyes locked on Darius, then flicked back to her tablet, and the hesitation that had held her moments ago began to crack. "This name," she continued, quieter but steadier, "it is not just on the guest list, it is on the deal structure." Ethan frowned, the words not fully landing. "What are you talking about?" he said, and for the first time there was a hint of something else beneath his tone. Not anger, not yet, but uncertainty, the kind that comes from missing a piece. Everyone else might already be starting to see. The man who had checked his phone earlier spoke next, his voice measured, but no longer neutral. "Ethan, you might want to check your messages," he said, and that sentence did something the room had not done before. It shifted authority, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Ethan reached for his phone finally, his movements no longer as controlled as before, his thumb unlocking the screen, his eyes scanning quickly, then slowing, then stopping, his expression tightening as the information settled in layers, not all at once, but enough to disrupt whatever confidence he had built around the moment. Before he looked up again at Darius, and this time the smile was gone, completely replaced by something sharper, more cautious. "What is this?" he asked, and the question was no longer about belonging, it was about understanding something he had already lost control of. Darius leaned back slightly, his voice still, even still measured. "It is already in motion," he said, and the room felt it, not the words themselves, but the certainty behind them, because nothing in his tone suggested reaction, nothing suggested retaliation, everything suggested completion, like a process that had begun before anyone else realized there was even a process to begin with. The junior analyst lowered her tablet slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He is the primary backer," she said, and even though the words were quiet, they carried across the table with the weight of something irreversible. Ethan blinked once, then again, his grip tightening slightly around his phone, as if holding it harder might change what it was telling him. The skyline outside remained unchanged, the city still moving, lights still shifting, but inside the room, everything had tilted just enough that no one was standing in quite the same place anymore. And at the center of it, Darius Cole sat exactly where he had been from the start, unmoved, unstained, in the only way that mattered, watching, not reacting, not correcting, simply allowing the room to catch up to a truth it had already tried to dismiss. The air did not just shift, it tightened like a wire pulled too far, and no one at the table seemed willing to be the first to snap it. Ethan's eyes moved across his phone again, slower this time, as if reading it differently might change what it said, but the numbers did not change, the names did not change, the structure did not change, and across from him Darius remained exactly where he had been, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, the wine still marking his shirt, but no longer defining him in any way that mattered. What is already in motion, Ethan repeated, quieter, now not to challenge, but to understand, because the question had turned on him. It was no longer about pushing someone out, it was about figuring out how far he had already gone. Without realizing it, Darius did not answer immediately, and that pause carried weight heavier than any explanation could have, because it forced the room to sit inside the uncertainty instead of escaping it. A man at the far end of the table leaned forward, his voice low but direct. Ethan, your brother just stepped out to take a call, and the tone of that sentence landed differently than anything else that had been said so far. It was not speculation, it was confirmation. Something had already reached beyond the room, beyond the table, beyond the moment, and now it was coming back with consequences attached. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, his fingers still wrapped around his phone, but no longer scrolling, just holding, as if waiting for it to say something else, something better, something that would restore the balance he thought he controlled. What did you do? He asked again, this time looking directly at Darius. And for the first time, there was no arrogance in the question, only calculation. Darius met his gaze without shifting, not leaning forward, not leaning back, just holding the moment steady like someone who had already measured its outcome before it began. I did not do anything, he said calmly. I just stopped something from continuing, and the distinction was small, but precise, and it landed in the room with a different kind of force because it reframed everything that had happened not as a reaction, but as a decision made long before this table had ever been set. The junior analyst took another step closer, now fully inside the edge of the conversation, her voice no longer hesitant, but careful, structured, like she was speaking inside a system. She understood the funding pipeline, she said, looking down at her tablet, then back up. It is routed through Cole Strategic Holdings. There is no secondary approval layer, it is direct control. The words were technical, but the meaning was clear enough to anyone who had been part of the deal structure. The money did not pass through layers, it did not wait for committees, it did not depend on consensus. It moved when one person decided it moved, and that person was sitting in front of them in a shirt stained with wine. Ethan blinked again, slower now, as if the room itself had become harder to process. Cole, he repeated the name, finally landing in full recognition, and the reaction that followed was not loud, it was internal, visible only in the way his shoulders adjusted, the way his breath changed, the way his grip on the phone loosened, just enough to show that something fundamental had shifted. You are saying you control the expansion, he said. And the question no longer carried disbelief, it carried the beginning of realization. The man beside him nodded once, not waiting for Darius to confirm, because the confirmation had already arrived on their screens and their messages. In the silence that had followed Darius's single action minutes earlier, Darius did not rush to claim it, he did not need to. The room was already doing the work of understanding for him. Control is not something you announce, he said quietly, it is something you recognize when it stops. And that sentence moved through the table like a slow wave, not dramatic, not explosive, but undeniable, because it explained everything without explaining anything. It told them what had changed without giving them a way to reverse it. Across the room, a few more guests had begun checking their phones. Conversations had shifted entirely, now no longer about introductions or opportunities, but about verification, about confirming what they were hearing, what they were seeing, what they had almost ignored. A woman near the window whispered to the person beside her, "That is him, I saw his name on the board report last quarter," and the whisper carried just far enough to reinforce what the room was already piecing together. Ethan leaned back slightly, now the chair beneath him no longer feeling as solid as it had moments before, his voice lower, measured, but no longer in control. "If this is some kind of play," he started, but the sentence did not finish, because even he could hear how weak it sounded, how disconnected from the reality forming around him. Darius tilted his head, just slightly, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement of the attempt. "This is not a play," he said, "it is a consequence." And the word consequence settled into the space between them heavier than anything else that had been spoken, because it implied sequence, cause and effect, action and result, and everyone at the table knew exactly where the sequence had begun. A phone rang somewhere behind them, not a soft vibration this time, but a clear, audible ring that cut through the tension like a signal no one could ignore. All eyes shifted toward the source, and then toward Ethan, because the call was coming from his device, his brother's name flashing across the screen in clear, bright letters, Charles Whitmore. And for a second Ethan did not answer, not because he did not want to but because he already knew that. Whatever was on the other side of that call would confirm everything he had just begun to understand. The room held its breath not in anticipation of drama, but in recognition of finality, because this was no longer about a misunderstanding or a social misstep. This was about something that had already been decided somewhere else and was now arriving in real time. Ethan finally lifted the phone to his ear, his movements slower than before, as if the weight of the moment had attached itself to his hands. He did not speak immediately. He listened, and whatever he heard drained the last trace of certainty from his face, his eyes flicking once toward Darius, then away, then back again, as if trying to reconcile the man in front of him with the reality unfolding through the call. And when he finally spoke, his voice was different, not loud, not commanding, but reduced, controlled by something he could not push against. "I understand," he said quietly, and the words did not sound like agreement. They sounded like acceptance. Around the table, no one moved, no one interrupted, no one attempted to redirect the moment, because there was nothing left to redirect. The structure of the room had already collapsed and reformed around a new center, and that center had not raised his voice, had not stood up, had not demanded attention. He had simply remained and let the truth arrive on its own time. And when Ethan lowered the phone back to the table, he did not look at anyone else first. He looked at Darius, because now there was no one else to look at, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of understanding, full of realization, full of something that could not be undone. And in that silence, Darius Cole sat exactly as he had from the beginning, unchanged, unaffected, and completely in control of a situation he had never needed to dominate to win. The silence did not break. It settled deeper like gravity, pulling every word down before it could escape. Ethan's hand remained on the phone even after the call had ended, as if letting go of it would confirm something. He was not ready to accept. The screen dimmed slowly, but he did not notice, because his attention had shifted entirely to the man across from him, the same man he had dismissed minutes earlier, the same man still sitting there with a wine stain on his shirt that now looked less like an accident and more like evidence of a mistake that could not be undone. "What did he say?" someone asked quietly from the far end of the table, not to interrupt, but because the question had become unavoidable. Ethan did not answer right away. His jaw tightened, then loosened, then tightened again, like he was choosing each word before it could betray him. "He said the funding is frozen," he replied finally, and the sentence landed heavier than anything else that had been spoken in the room, not because of its volume, but because of its finality. Frozen meant halted, not delayed, not reviewed, not reconsidered. Halted in a way that stopped everything built on top of it. Deals paused, timelines collapsed, expectations erased. A ripple moved through the table, subtle but undeniable. Shoulders shifted, backs straightened, eyes dropped to screens again, as if hoping to find a version of the situation that still made sense. But there was no alternative version. There was only this one, and it was unfolding in real time. Across from them, Darius remained still, his presence unchanged, as if nothing in the last few minutes had required him to adjust at all, and that steadiness began to carry a different kind of weight, now not passive, not quiet, but absolute, because it revealed something the room had not accounted for: control that did not need to announce itself, control that did not react, because it had already acted. Ethan exhaled slowly, placing the phone down on the table, this time with intention, not carelessness. The sound of it meeting the surface was soft, but it marked a transition. Something internal, shifting from denial to recognition. "You knew this would happen," he said, looking directly at Darius. And for the first time, there was no attempt to dominate the moment, only to understand it. Darius held his gaze. "I knew it was possible," he replied, and the distinction mattered because it removed emotion from the equation. It was not about revenge, it was about structure, about what happens when certain actions meet certain systems without interference. A man to Ethan's right leaned forward, his voice controlled but urgent. "Is there a way to reverse it?" he asked, not to challenge, but to solve, because that was what rooms like this were built for: solutions, adjustments, ways to restore balance. But no one answered immediately, not even Ethan, because the answer did not belong to him anymore. All eyes turned to Darius, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, as understanding aligned with attention. And when Darius finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, unchanged from the beginning. "You are asking the wrong question," he said, and the words redirected the entire focus of the room. "Not how do we reverse it, But why did it happen? And that shift in framing did something deeper than any explanation could have. It forced accountability into a space that had been operating without it moments earlier. A woman across the table lowered her glass, slowly, her voice quieter now, as if matching the weight of the moment. Because it was allowed, she said almost to herself, because no one stopped it. And the statement did not accuse anyone directly, but it included everyone at the table, every silence, every glance, every moment that had passed without correction. Darius nodded once, not in agreement with her specifically, but in acknowledgement of the truth. She had named rooms like this do not create outcomes. He said they reveal them, and the sentence settled into the space with precision because it reframed everything that had just happened, not as an isolated incident, but as a reflection of something already present, something already accepted, something that had simply been given the chance to show itself. Ethan looked down at the table for a brief second, then back up, his expression no longer defensive, no longer dismissive, but calculating in a different way, now measuring not power, but consequence. If I apologize, he began, the words slower than before, more deliberate. Will it change anything? The question was direct, but it carried something new, not authority, not expectation, but uncertainty. And again the room turned to Darius, because again the answer did not exist anywhere else. Darius did not respond immediately. He let the question sit long enough for its weight to be fully felt, because timing was still the only thing he had not rushed. Apology is not a tool, he said finally. It is a recognition, and recognition does not move systems, only decisions do. And the distinction closed the door that Ethan had just tried to open, not harshly, not aggressively, but completely. Across the table a man checked his phone again, his voice cutting through the quiet. They are already issuing internal alerts, he said. Compliance teams are flagging the contract as inactive. Another voice followed from behind him. Secondary partners are pulling back, they are not waiting for confirmation. And with each update the scope widened, no longer contained to this table, no longer contained to this building. It was moving outward through networks, through structures, through decisions made by people who were not even in the room, but were responding to what had already been set in motion. Ethan leaned back in his chair, this time fully, the posture no longer controlled, no longer strategic, but accepting of a shift he could not redirect. His eyes moved once more to the stain on Darius's shirt, then back to his face, and for the first time there was no attempt to justify what had happened, only to acknowledge its weight. This was never about the seat, was it? He said quietly, and the question held more understanding than anything he had said so far. Darius shook his head slightly. No, it was about the assumption, and the word assumption carried everything inside it, the judgment, the dismissal, the permission to act without consequence that had defined the moment before it unfolded around them. The skyline outside remained unchanged, but inside the room, everything had been reordered, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. And at the center of it, Darius Cole finally moved, not quickly, not abruptly, just enough to signal that the moment had reached its natural conclusion. He placed his hand lightly against the table and stood, the chair sliding back with a soft, controlled sound that did not demand attention, but received it anyway. Every eye followed him, now not out of curiosity, but out of recognition of what they had just witnessed, not a reaction, not a confrontation, but a revelation of power that had been present the entire time. And as he adjusted his jacket slightly, the stain still visible, still untouched, he looked once more at Ethan, his voice steady, his tone unchanged from the beginning. You did not lose the deal because of me, he said. You lost it because you showed me who you were before you knew who I was. And the sentence did not rise, it did not echo, but it remained hanging in the air long after he turned and began to walk away, leaving behind a table that no longer looked the same, because the people sitting at it no longer saw themselves the same way either. And the silence that followed him this time was not empty, it was full of understanding, full of consequence, and full of something no one in that room would forget. The sound of Darius's footsteps did not echo loudly across the polished floor, but they carried anyway, each step measured, unhurried, controlled, like everything else he had done since he walked into the room. And behind him the table remained frozen, not because they could not move, but because they did not know how to move forward from what had just happened. Ethan did not call after him, did not attempt to stop him, because the instinct to control had finally been replaced by something unfamiliar, something heavier, the recognition that the moment was no longer his to shape. A few guests shifted in their seats, then stood slowly, not to follow Darius, but to reposition themselves, as if distance from the table might distance them from what had unfolded. The junior analyst lowered her tablet completely, now her hand still, but her mind racing through everything she had just witnessed, the name, the structure, the decision, the consequence, all aligning into a single realization that would stay with her far longer than the evening itself. A server approached cautiously, holding a clean cloth, as if finally remembering a duty that should have been obvious minutes ago. But before she could speak, Darius had already passed beyond the table, moving toward the far end of the room, where the glass walls reflected the city back at him, the wine stain still visible against his shirt, but now carrying no weight, no embarrassment, no urgency. It remained simply because he chose not to remove it. Because removing it would suggest something needed to be corrected, and nothing about the situation required correction on his part. Near the exit, a man in a navy suit stepped aside, instinctively giving Darius space, without being asked, his head nodding slightly, not in greeting, but an acknowledgement, the kind of acknowledgement that comes when understanding arrives too late to change anything, but still demands recognition. Darius returned the gesture with the smallest movement of his eyes, then continued forward. The doors opened silently as he approached the mechanism, responding before his hand even reached for it. And the cool air of the corridor met him without resistance. Inside the room behind him, the tension did not dissolve. It redistributed. Conversations restarted, but they did not sound the same. They were quieter, more deliberate, words chosen carefully, as if each sentence now carried the risk of consequence. Ethan remained seated longer than anyone expected, his eyes fixed on the empty space where Darius had been, as if the absence itself required processing. A man beside him leaned in, his voice low. "We need to contain this," he said. But even as he spoke, it was clear containment was no longer possible. The information had already moved beyond the room, beyond the building, into systems that did not pause for damage control. Ethan shook his head slightly, not in refusal, but in realization. "You cannot contain something that has already been decided," he replied, echoing the logic he had just been forced to understand. Across the table, another guest stood, abruptly gathering his belongings with more urgency than necessary. "We should review our exposure," he said, to no one in particular, but everyone heard it. Because now every connection to the deal, every layer of involvement, every assumption about stability had been called into question. The woman, who had spoken earlier about silence, looked down at her glass again, then set it aside, without drinking, her reflection faint in the surface of the table, as if she was seeing herself differently than she had when the night began, because the room had not just witnessed a loss, it had witnessed a standard, a line that had been crossed without awareness and corrected without negotiation. Outside in the corridor, Darius did not stop immediately. He walked the length of the hall, past a series of closed doors, each one identical, each one leading to rooms where decisions like this were made daily, but rarely revealed. So clearly his phone vibrated once, then again. He did not rush to answer. He did not even look down right away, because he already understood the nature of the message's confirmations, updates, acknowledgments from teams already executing what had been set in motion minutes earlier. When he finally glanced at the screen, the notifications aligned exactly as expected. Contract status updated, compliance confirmed, partner withdrawals initiated. No urgency in the language, only precision, because the system did not react, it followed direction, and the direction had been clear from the moment he sent that single message. He paused briefly near the end of the corridor, where the glass opened into a view of the city below, lights stretching across blocks, traffic moving in steady lines, the rhythm of a world that did not pause for individual moments, no matter how significant they felt. Inside a single room, he adjusted his jacket slightly, not to hide the stain, but to settle the fabric back into place. The motion, small, practical, final. A reflection appeared beside him in the glass, another figure approaching slower, more hesitant. Charles Whitmore stopped a few feet away, not close enough to claim familiarity, not far enough to avoid responsibility, his posture controlled, but his expression carrying something that had not been present earlier, recognition, not of status, but of consequence. "Mr. Cole," he began, his voice measured, respectful in a way that contrasted sharply with what had occurred minutes before. Darius did not turn immediately. He let the city remain in his view for a moment longer, then shifted just enough to acknowledge the presence, without fully engaging. Charles continued, "We were not aware of the situation as it unfolded," and the statement was careful, constructed to distance himself from the action without denying its existence. But Darius did not respond to the wording. He responded to the reality. "Awareness is not required for consequence," he said quietly, and the sentence did not accuse, it clarified the boundary between intention And outcome, Charles exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering briefly, then returning. I would like the opportunity to address this properly, he said, and the request carried weight, not because of who he was, but because of what had already been lost. Darius met his eyes now fully, his expression unchanged from the beginning of the evening. You already did, he replied. And the simplicity of the response closed the space between them, not with hostility, but with finality, because there was no additional step, no follow-up, no negotiation that could alter what had already been set in motion. Charles held the gaze for a second longer, then nodded once the movement, small, contained, but real. Understood, he said, and in that moment the balance of the room, the deal, the evening itself settled into its new shape, not repaired, not restored, but defined. Darius turned back toward the corridor, his path clear, his pace unchanged as he moved toward the elevator at the far end. The doors opened as he approached, again responding without hesitation, and as he stepped inside, he did not look back, not at Charles, not at the room, not at the table where everything had shifted, because there was nothing left to confirm. The truth had already revealed itself, and the consequences were already moving through every system connected to that moment. And as the doors closed softly, sealing the space behind him, the only thing that remained of what had happened was not the stain on his shirt, not the silence in the room, but the understanding carried by everyone who had witnessed it, that power does not need to be announced, it only needs to be recognized when it is no longer there. The elevator doors closed without sound, sealing the moment behind him, but not ending it, because moments like that did not end. They expanded, moving outward through conversations, through decisions, through systems that had already begun adjusting to a new reality. Darius stood alone inside the mirrored space, his reflection steady, unshaken, the stain still marking his shirt, like a quiet signature of what had just occurred, not something to erase, but something to remember, not for himself, but for the pattern it represented. The elevator began its descent, smooth, controlled, no sudden movement, no urgency, matching the way he had carried himself from the beginning. His phone vibrated again, then again, a steady rhythm, now messages stacking, confirmations aligning, one notification from compliance, contract status permanently suspended, another from legal risk exposure minimized following termination of agreement, a third from a partner firm requesting immediate realignment of their portfolio. Language precise, clean, devoid of emotion, because systems did not react, they executed, and every message carried the same underlying truth. The decision had already propagated. There was no pause, no reconsideration, only continuation. When the elevator reached the lower level, the doors opened to a quieter space, the noise of the gala replaced by the distant hum of the building itself. The marble floor extended outward, polished and empty. A few staff members moved through the lobby, their pace measured, their attention focused on their own tasks, until one of them glanced up, recognized him, not with certainty, but with instinct, something in his presence triggering awareness without needing explanation. She straightened slightly, offering a respectful nod that was returned just as simply, and Darius stepped forward, crossing the lobby. Without hesitation, the glass doors ahead parted automatically, letting in the cool air of the city night. The temperature difference subtle but noticeable, a shift from controlled environment to open space, from curated power to real movement. Outside, the street carried its own rhythm, headlights passing in steady lines, voices blending into the distance, the kind of energy that did not care about private rooms or exclusive tables, because it operated on a different scale, one that did not require permission. Darius paused for a brief moment at the edge of the sidewalk, not to reflect, not to reconsider, but to allow the transition to complete. Behind him, the building stood unchanged from the outside, its glass surface reflecting the same skyline. It had before nothing about its appearance revealed what had just occurred inside, but that was always the nature of moments like this. The outside remained constant while the inside redefined itself. His phone rang, this time not a message, not a notification, but a direct call. The name displayed clear, familiar, Carla Evans. He answered without delay, his voice steady. Carla. His tone did not rise, did not shift, it remained consistent, because consistency was part of control. Everything is confirmed, she said immediately, her voice sharp, efficient. The contract has been formally terminated across all divisions. Whitmore Holdings has initiated internal review, but the funding channels are already locked. They cannot reroute in time. Darius listened without interruption, not because he needed the information to understand what had happened, but because he respected the precision of its delivery. Any external pressure, he asked, keeping the question narrow, focused, contained nothing actionable. She replied, there is noise, but no leverage secondary partners. Are withdrawing independently. No one wants to carry the exposure. He nodded once even though she could not see it. That is expected, he said, because once a structure lost its foundation, everything built on top of it became optional. Carla paused briefly, then added, there is one more thing. Media inquiries have started. Internal sources are talking, but nothing public. Yet Darius looked out across the street, watching a line of traffic move through the intersection, lights changing in sequence, red to green, green to yellow, yellow to red, systems everywhere, following rules, responding to input. Without emotion, hold response, he said finally. No statement, no clarification. Let the structure speak for itself. Understood, she replied. And the call ended as cleanly as it began. No extra words, no unnecessary closure, because none was needed. Darius slipped the phone back into his pocket, adjusting his jacket slightly again, the motion habitual, now not to fix anything, but to maintain alignment. A black car pulled up to the curb in front of him, the driver stepping out quickly, opening the rear door with a level of attentiveness that suggested familiarity, not with his face, but with his presence. Yes, sir, the driver said. Respectfully, Darius nodded once, stepping inside, the door closing behind him with a soft, controlled sound, the interior quiet, insulated from the outside world. As the car merged into traffic, the building began to recede behind him, its height still visible in the side mirror, but its relevance already diminishing because the moment that defined it had already passed, and what remained was not the location, but the impact inside the gala room above. Conversations had not stopped. They had fractured, groups forming and reforming as people attempted to process what had happened. Some spoke in low tones, analyzing the structure of the deal. Others remained silent, their attention fixed on screens confirming the updates arriving in real time. Ethan had not moved for several minutes after Darius left, his posture, still, his expression contained, but different now, not from anger, not from embarrassment, but from recognition, the kind that rewrote understanding. In a single moment, a man approached him cautiously, placing a hand on the back of the chair, not touching him, but close enough to signal presence. We need to address this immediately, he said. Ethan did not respond at first, his gaze fixed on the table, where the glass still sat, where the stains still marked the fabric, where everything had begun. He finally spoke, his voice low, controlled. We already did, he said, and the statement did not carry defiance, it carried conclusion, because the decision had already been made, the moment had already been defined. There was no second version, no alternate outcome, only the one that had unfolded exactly as it had been allowed to unfold. Across the room, the junior analyst stood near the edge, now no longer hidden behind her device, her eyes moving between conversations, between reactions, between the subtle shifts in behavior that revealed more than any words. Could she look down at her tablet one more time? The name still there, the structure still intact. But now it meant something different, not just data, not just information, but a lesson written in real time about how quickly perception could collapse when it met reality, and how expensive that collapse could be. The woman who had spoken earlier about silence remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the table, her gaze steady. Not on Ethan, not on anyone else, but on the space where Darius had been, as if the absence itself carried weight, as if it demanded acknowledgement that went beyond the moment itself. Because what had been revealed was not just about one interaction, it was about a pattern, one that had existed long before tonight, and would continue to exist unless recognized for what it was. And as the room slowly adjusted to its new state, one thing remained clear to everyone present: nothing that had happened could be undone, not the words, not the actions, not the decision, and not the cost. And far below, in the quiet movement of the city, Darius Cole sat in the back of a car, moving forward without looking back, because he did not need to. What mattered had already been revealed, and what followed would simply be the continuation of something he had already decided long before anyone else realized there was a decision to be made. The car moved smoothly through the city, but the world outside did not blur. It sharpened, each passing light, each reflection sliding across the glass like a sequence of signals confirming what had already been set in motion. Darius sat back, not in relaxation, but in alignment, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, as if the movement of the vehicle was simply an extension of his own control. The stain on his shirt remained untouched, now darker at the edges where it had settled into the fabric, but even that had shifted in meaning. It was no longer an interruption, it was a marker, a visible trace of a moment that had revealed more than it had damaged. His phone remained silent for a few seconds longer than before, in In that silence, there was no tension, no anticipation, only completion, because when a decision reached this level, it no longer needed constant confirmation. It simply continued. The driver glanced briefly into the rearview mirror, then back to the road, his voice respectful. Measured traffic is light tonight, sir. We will reach Midtown in 10 minutes. Darius nodded once, not because the timing mattered, but because acknowledgement was part of rhythm, part of maintaining the flow of interaction without unnecessary disruption. Outside, a digital billboard shifted its display from one luxury brand to another. The images crisp, controlled, curated, just like the room he had left behind. But unlike that room, the billboard did not pretend to decide who belonged. It only reflected what was paid to be seen, and the difference between those two systems settled quietly in his mind, not as frustration, not as reflection, but as clarity, because he had learned long ago that environments do not define value. They reveal perception, and perception, when left unchecked, becomes assumption, and assumption, when given power, becomes action. The phone vibrated again, this time a different name appearing on the screen. James Holloway. He answered without delay. James's tone, unchanged. The response on the other end carried urgency, but not panic. We just received confirmation from 2 additional partners. They are pulling out completely. He said their risk teams flagged the termination as structural, not situational. They are not waiting for any negotiation. Darius listened without interruption, because this was the continuation, not the escalation, and that distinction mattered. Any resistance, he asked, already fading. James replied, they are trying to stabilize their internal messaging, but there is no external pushback. No one wants to attach themselves to this exposure. Darius looked out the window again, the city moving with the same consistency as before, nothing in its rhythm, acknowledging the shift that had just occurred at a level far above the street. But that was always the case. The largest decisions rarely changed the visible surface, they changed the underlying structure. Understood, he said. Proceed with phase alignment. Redirect capital to secondary channels. Prioritize continuity over expansion. Yes, Sir. James replied, and the call ended as efficiently as it began. No excess, no hesitation. The sequence remained intact. Inside the gala room, the energy had settled into something quieter, but more intense. Conversations had split into smaller clusters, voices lowered, not out of discretion, but out of calculation, because now every word carried weight, every statement could reveal alignment or distance, and distance had become valuable. Ethan finally stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a controlled motion that signaled a shift in position rather than emotion. His chair slid back with a soft sound that drew attention, not because it was loud, but because everything else had become so quiet. He looked across the table, once more the same faces still present, but no longer arranged in the same hierarchy, because the structure that had defined them minutes earlier no longer applied. We need to regroup, he said, his voice steady but no longer authoritative, more procedural than commanding, and that difference did not go unnoticed. The man beside him nodded, but did not immediately follow, instead checking his phone again, as if the real direction was no longer coming from within the room. A woman across the table spoke next, her tone measured, direct. The issue is not internal, she said, it is external perception, and that sentence reframed the conversation entirely, because it acknowledged what no one had said out loud yet. This was no longer contained to those who had witnessed it. The ripple had already moved beyond them. The junior analyst stepped forward again, no longer hesitant, her voice clearer, now, as if the structure of the situation had given her permission to speak. The perception is already defined, she said, looking at her tablet, then up at the group. The narrative is forming around loss of control, not just termination, and the words landed precisely because they aligned with what everyone was beginning to realize. Control had not just shifted, it had been exposed as temporary, conditional, dependent on something they had not fully understood. Ethan turned toward her, his expression focused, not dismissive, and for the first time he listened without interruption. What are the numbers? He asked, the question direct, functional, because now everything had to be translated into measurable impact. She glanced down briefly, then back up. Preliminary estimates show a loss of $2.4 billion in projected expansion value, she said, but the secondary impact is larger. Partner confidence is already declining, and the clarity of her delivery removed any remaining ambiguity. This was not a temporary setback, it was a structural collapse. Across the room, a man exhaled sharply, running a hand across his forehead, not in panic, but in recognition of scale. This is going to spread, he said quietly, and no one disagreed. because the spread had already begun. It was simply a matter of how far and how fast. Outside, the car turned onto a quieter street, the buildings taller, closer, the lights more contained. The driver slowed slightly. As they approached a private entrance, "Sir, we have arrived," he said, stepping out quickly to open the door. Darius exited without hesitation, the air cooler here, the sound of the city more distant, the building in front of him understated but precise, no unnecessary display, only structure. He moved inside, the lobby empty except for a single receptionist who looked up immediately, her posture straightening, not out of surprise but recognition of presence. "Welcome back, Mr. Cole," she said, her tone professional but carrying a layer of respect that did not depend on knowing what had just happened, only on understanding who he was within this space. Darius acknowledged her with a slight nod, then continued toward the elevators, his pace unchanged, the same controlled movement that had carried him through the entire evening, because nothing about his trajectory had required adjustment. The elevator doors opened instantly, responding to his approach, and as he stepped inside, the mirrored walls reflected him again, the stain still visible, the posture still steady, the presence still absolute. And in that reflection, there was no trace of reaction, only continuation, because what had happened was not an interruption, it was confirmation. And as the doors closed and the elevator began to rise, this time upward instead of down, the only thing that remained constant was the understanding that power does not need to prove itself, it only needs to be revealed at the moment others forget it is there. And in the quiet precision of that realization, everything that followed was simply the natural outcome of a decision that had already been made. The elevator rose in silence, but it did not feel like ascent. It felt like alignment, like everything that had unfolded below was settling into place above. Darius stood centered in the mirrored space, his reflection multiplied on every side, not distorted, not fragmented, but consistent from every angle, the same steady posture, the same unshaken presence, the same quiet control that had never once required validation. The stain on his shirt remained visible, deeper now as it dried, but even that had transformed into something else, not a mark of disrespect, but a marker of exposure, a moment captured not in memory alone, but in reality, because it had forced a room full of power to confront itself without preparation. The elevator slowed, then stopped, the doors opening onto a private floor where the atmosphere shifted, immediately quieter, more intentional, the lighting softer, the space designed not to impress, but to function. And as Darius stepped out, the environment responded to him without hesitation, a subtle recognition built into the structure itself, the kind that did not ask who he was because it already knew. His footsteps carried forward across the polished floor, the sound controlled, deliberate, echoing just enough to mark presence without demanding attention. A glass wall stretched along one side, revealing the city from a higher vantage point, the grid of lights below forming patterns that mirrored the systems he had just moved through, each light representing motion, each motion connected to a decision, and every decision tied back to a structure that either held or failed depending on how it was built. His office stood at the end of the corridor, the door already unlocked as he approached, and when he entered the space, did not change. It remained exactly as it had been before the evening began, because nothing inside it required adjustment. The desk clean, the screens active, the data flowing in real time across multiple displays, each line of information confirming the continuation of what had already been set in motion. Darius moved toward the desk, placing his hand lightly against its surface, not to steady himself, but to re-establish position. A small motion, but precise, because position mattered not physically, but structurally. Where you stood determined what you could see, and what you could see determined what you could control. His phone vibrated again, this time with layered notifications, not just confirmations, but expansions, new alignments forming in response to the vacuum that had been created. One firm stepping in to explore partnership opportunities, another signaling interest in restructured investment channels. Capital did not disappear, it moved, and it always moved toward stability, toward clarity, toward control, and Darius watched it shift in real time, not with surprise, but with recognition, because this was not a disruption, it was a redistribution, and redistribution, when guided correctly, created opportunity out of collapse. A soft knock at the door broke the rhythm, not sharply, not urgently, just enough to signal presence without intrusion. "Come in," he said, his voice even unchanged. The door opened, and Carla stepped inside, her posture composed, her expression focused. She did not carry files, did not need them. Everything she needed was already in motion. "The updates are complete," she said, moving toward the desk. "The termination has triggered Three separate market responses. Whitmore Holdings is already attempting to stabilize their position, but their exposure is too visible. The secondary partners are repositioning faster than expected, and the numbers she placed on the screen reflected exactly that movement. A cascade of adjustments, each one logical, each one inevitable. Once the initial decision had been made, Darius reviewed the data quickly, not rushing, not lingering, just confirming alignment. And the internal review, he asked. Carla nodded. Already underway. Internal reports suggest this was not an isolated incident. Their risk management protocols failed to account for reputational triggers, which means this was always a possibility. The statement carried more than information, it carried implication that what had happened was not just about one moment, one action, one individual. It was about a system that had not been built to recognize its own weaknesses until they were exposed, and exposure always came at a cost. Darius stepped slightly to the side, his gaze shifting to the city beyond the glass, the same skyline, the same lights, but now framed differently. From this height, from this position, the view did not feel distant, it felt structured. Each block, each street, each movement part of a larger design. And within that design, there were patterns, some visible, some hidden, some ignored, until they could no longer be overlooked. I want full audit visibility, he said finally, his tone calm but precise. Every interaction, every report, every flagged incident across their last 12 months. If there is a pattern, we document it completely. Carla nodded immediately, already anticipating the directive. Understood. I will coordinate with compliance and legal to ensure full access. She paused briefly, then added, there is something else. Internal communications from their side are already shifting the narrative. They are framing this as an overreaction, a strategic misalignment rather than a consequence. Darius did not turn immediately. He let the words settle into the space between them, not reacting, not dismissing, simply placing them within the structure of everything else. And then he spoke. Perception follows control, he said, and right now they do not have it. The simplicity of the statement removed any need for further discussion, because narrative without structure could not hold for long. It would shift, it would fracture, it would eventually align with reality, because reality was already moving through every system connected to the event. Carla allowed a slight pause, then nodded again. I will monitor external developments, she said before stepping back toward the door, leaving the room as quietly as she had entered. And once again the space returned to its original state, silent, focused, continuous. Darius remained by the window for a moment longer, his reflection faint against the glass, the city stretching beyond it, unchanged in appearance, but subtly altered in structure, because somewhere within its grid a decision had been made, a shift had occurred, and the ripple of that shift would continue long after the moment itself had faded. He adjusted his jacket, once more the motion, now final, settling into place, not to hide the stain, but to carry it forward as part of the sequence, because what had happened was not something to remove, it was something to integrate into the pattern of everything that came next. And as he turned back toward the desk, the screens continued to update, the data continued to flow. The system continued to respond, and within that flow there was no uncertainty, no hesitation, only continuation, because power, when properly understood, did not react to moments, it absorbed them and used them to define what came after. And in that quiet, controlled space far above the room, where everything had begun, Darius Cole stood exactly where he needed to be, not elevated, not removed, but positioned at the center of a structure that no longer needed to prove itself to anyone who had already made the mistake of underestimating it. The room behind him had already begun rewriting its own version of the story, but up here there was no need for revision, only clarity. Darius stood at the center of his office, the city stretched beneath him, like a system already mapped, already understood, and on the screens in front of him, the ripple continued, expanding, not in chaos, not in noise, but in structure, lines of data, shifting columns, updating notifications, aligning into a pattern that confirmed what had already been set into motion. Nothing was out of place, nothing was unpredictable, because this was not disruption, this was exposure. His phone lit up again, this time with a priority tag, internal legal briefing. He accepted the call without hesitation, the voice on the other end calm, controlled, precise. Mr. Cole, we have completed the initial compliance sweep. There are irregularities within Whitmore Holdings documentation that were previously flagged, but never escalated. The implication was immediate, not just a failure of behavior, but a failure of oversight. Darius did not interrupt. He allowed the information to unfold. Because sequence mattered. What level of exposure? He asked, his tone even as always Moderate to high, the voice replied. Their internal reports show at least 3 incidents of unaddressed complaints related to guest profiling in partner environments, the kind of pattern that becomes critical when combined with financial instability. Darius shifted his gaze slightly, not away from the screens, but deeper into them, connecting layers of information that others would treat separately. Behavior, risk, capital flow, all part of the same structure, all influencing the same outcome. Document everything he said, no summary, no interpretation, just verified records. Understood, the voice confirmed, and the call ended, leaving the room in silence again. Not empty silence, but full structured silence, the kind that carries momentum instead of waiting for it. A notification appeared on the main screen. Media monitoring, early signals, detected. No headlines yet, but internal leaks beginning to surface. Phrases like unexpected withdrawal, loss of confidence, structural collapse, already forming the narrative before it had even reached the public eye. And Darius watched it without reaction, because narrative followed structure, not the other way around. Carla re-entered quietly, not needing to announce herself. The updates are accelerating, she said, moving beside him. Several firms are repositioning publicly. They are not naming Whitmore directly, but the implication is clear. Darius nodded, once not surprised, just confirming alignment. And the audit findings, he asked. She placed a file on the desk, not physical but projected across the screen. The records are consistent, she said. Low-level complaints dismissed, minor incidents overlooked, nothing large enough individually to trigger action, but together they form a pattern, and patterns, when revealed, changed everything, because they removed the possibility of calling something isolated. They showed continuity, they showed design, even when it was unintentional, and once that was visible, it could not be unseen. This is not just financial, he said quietly, it is structural. She met his gaze, understanding immediately, which meant the impact would not stop at contracts or partnerships. It would move into reputation, into trust, into every layer that depended on perception being stable. Outside the office, the city continued its motion uninterrupted. Taxis moved, lights shifted, people crossed streets, unaware that somewhere above them a structure had already begun to collapse and reform in response to a single decision made. Without hesitation, Darius stepped closer to the screen, his reflection faint over the data, the stain still visible, not hidden, not acknowledged, simply present as part of the sequence. Initiate controlled release, he said finally, his voice steady, not loud, not forceful, but absolute. Carla did not question the directive. She understood its precision. Release the audit findings through third-party verification, not as accusation, not as retaliation, as documentation of fact. She nodded, already moving to execute. And as she did, the system responded immediately, connections forming, channels opening, information beginning to move outward, not as noise, but as signal. Inside the gala room, the shift had reached its next stage, conversations no longer speculative, now grounded in confirmation. Screens filled with updates, messages arriving faster than they could be processed. Ethan stood near the edge of the room, no longer at the center. His position changed, not physically, but structurally. The man who had once defined the tone now responding to it. A voice approached from behind him, low, urgent. The audit reports are surfacing. He turned slightly, his expression tightening, not from surprise, but from the recognition that the situation had moved beyond any single action. What reports, he asked, though part of him already knew. Compliance records, the man replied. Past incidents, internal dismissals. It is forming a pattern. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for a brief second before returning to the room. And in that moment, he understood something that had not been clear before. This was never about one interaction. It was about everything that had been allowed before it, everything that had not been corrected, everything that had been dismissed as insignificant until it combined into something undeniable. A woman across the room spoke next, her voice cutting through the noise, not loudly, but clearly. This is not going to stop here, she said, and no one disagreed, because they could see it unfolding in real time, the ripple moving outward, touching every connection, every assumption, every structure that had depended on stability. Returning to the office, Darius watched the first external confirmations appear, not headlines, not yet, but signals from analysts, from internal sources, from networks that responded faster than traditional media. Could the language consistent, controlled, aligned with the data that had been released? No exaggeration, no distortion, just fact presented in a way that could not be ignored. Carla looked at him briefly. The first wave is out, she said, and there was no need for further explanation, because both of them understood what that meant. The narrative had shifted permanently, not because it had been forced, But because it had been revealed, Darius nodded once, then stepped back slightly, allowing the system to continue without interference, because this stage did not require action. It required observation. The structure had already been set. The sequence already initiated, and now it would move on its own path, shaped by the very things it had exposed outside. The city lights flickered in their endless pattern, each one part of a system that did not stop for individual moments, but adapted to them, absorbed them, incorporated them into a larger design, and inside that design Darius Cole remained exactly where he had always been, not reacting, not chasing, not correcting, simply holding position as everything else adjusted around him, because true control was not about changing direction, it was about knowing that the direction had already been set long before anyone else realized they were moving. The first headline did not arrive with noise. It arrived with precision, a single line buried in a financial feed that only a few in the room were watching at first, but those few were enough because they understood how signals worked when they appeared in the right places at the right time. Whitmore expansion faces sudden capital withdrawal, the wording careful, neutral, but unmistakable, and within seconds it began to replicate across terminals, across devices, across networks that did not wait for confirmation before adjusting their positions. Ethan saw it at the same moment as everyone else's phone lighting up again. The same message echoed through multiple channels, each one reinforcing the same reality. The structure had shifted, and it was no longer contained inside a private room. He did not speak immediately, because there was nothing left to assert, nothing left to control, only something left to acknowledge. The man beside him leaned closer, his voice tight. "This is already public." Ethan nodded, once not in agreement, but in recognition. Because public did not mean announced, it meant visible to those who mattered, and that visibility was already enough across the room. More phones lit up, more screens turned, more conversations halted mid-sentence as attention moved toward the same source, the same signal, the same unfolding confirmation. A woman near the window spoke under her breath. "It is spreading," and the words did not carry fear, they carried certainty, because spread was not a possibility anymore, it was a function already in motion. The junior analyst stood still. Her tablet no longer needed the information, now everywhere reflected back at her from every direction. The name Darius Cole no longer just a line in a system, but the center of a shift she had watched unfold in real time, and now could see extending far beyond the room. Ethan finally exhaled, a slow, controlled breath, his posture straightening, not to reclaim authority, but to maintain composure, because composure was the last thing still within his reach. "What are they saying?" he asked, though the question was less about information and more about framing. The man beside him answered quickly. "Analysts are calling it a confidence break. They are linking it to governance concerns, not just funding," and that distinction cut deeper than the number itself, because funding could be replaced, but confidence, once broken, required something else, something longer, something harder, to rebuild. Another voice joined from behind them. "Compliance teams are reviewing historical reports. They are not waiting for statements, they are acting on the audit release." And the word audit settled into the space with weight, because it confirmed what had been suspected. This was no longer a single moment, it was a documented pattern, now visible, now measurable, now impossible to dismiss. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, not in defeat, but in recalibration, because the situation had moved beyond reaction into consequence, and consequence required a different kind of thinking, a different kind of response. He opened them again, looking across the room, not at any one person, but at the collective shift, the way people stood, the way they held their phones, the way they avoided or engaged with eye contact, each movement now carrying awareness of what had just happened and what it meant for everyone connected to it. "We need a statement," he said finally, his voice steady but stripped of its earlier certainty, something controlled, something immediate. But even as he spoke, the words felt incomplete, because statements belonged to moments that could still be shaped, and this one had already passed. A woman across from him shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in clarity. "A statement will not change this," she said. "It might slow perception, but it will not reverse structure," and the precision of her words landed exactly where they needed to, because they aligned with what everyone was beginning to understand. This was not about messaging, it was about foundation, and the foundation had already shifted outside the building. The city continued without pause. Traffic lights changed, people moved, conversations happened, unaware of the exact moment above them that had triggered a cascade across multiple industries, but within financial networks, within corporate structures, within systems that tracked movement. Instead of noise, the impact was immediate, and measurable back in the office. Darius watched the second wave begin, not through headlines, but through alignment. Firms that had hesitated now moving decisively, capital redirecting not cautiously, but with purpose, because uncertainty had been replaced by clarity, and clarity created momentum. Carla stood beside him, reviewing the incoming data. Secondary channels are stabilizing, she said. Capital is not retreating, it is relocating. Exactly as expected. Darius nodded, once not as approval but as confirmation, because the pattern was consistent with the structure, and the structure had been built to respond this way. Any resistance, he asked. Minimal, she replied. Most entities are choosing alignment over defense. They do not want to be positioned on the wrong side of this. And again, the language mattered. Alignment, not escape, not avoidance, but deliberate repositioning toward stability, toward control, toward the source that had just demonstrated both. Darius shifted his attention to another screen, where internal reports continued to update, the audit findings expanding now, corroborated by independent verification, each new data point reinforcing the same narrative, not created, not forced, but revealed. The pattern existed, the moment had exposed it, and the system had responded accordingly. Inside the gala room, Charles Whitmore re-entered the space, his presence quieter than before, his posture still composed, but carrying a different weight, not authority, not command, but responsibility. His eyes moved across the room, quickly taking in the screens, the conversations, the posture of his brother, standing no longer at the center, but within the structure of consequence. He approached Ethan without rushing, his voice low but clear. What is the current status? Ethan did not look away from his phone as he answered. Funding is terminated, partners are withdrawing, audit reports are circulating, and the clarity of his response removed any need for interpretation. Charles nodded, once his gaze steady. This is no longer containable, he said, and again no one disagreed, because containment required control, and control had already shifted earlier that evening to someone who was no longer in the room. A pause settled between them, not empty, but full of recognition of the sequence that had led them here, and the fact that nothing within that sequence could be undone, only responded to, and even response now felt secondary to the movement already in progress. Back in the office, Darius remained still, not because there was nothing to do, but because everything that needed to be done had already been initiated. The system continued to move, the data continued to align, the structure continued to respond, and within that movement, there was no urgency, only direction, because urgency belonged to uncertainty, and uncertainty had already been removed. He adjusted his sleeves slightly, the fabric settling back into place, the stains still visible, still present, but no longer carrying any weight beyond its function, as a reminder not of what had been done to him, but of what had been revealed through it. And as another notification appeared on the screen, confirming the next stage of alignment, he did not react, he did not comment, he simply observed. Because observation at this level was not passive, it was confirmation that the system was functioning exactly as intended, and in that quiet, controlled space above the city, the outcome of the evening was no longer unfolding, it had already been defined, everything else was simply catching up to it. The second headline did not ask for attention, it demanded alignment. Global partners reassess exposure following governance concerns at Whitmore Holdings. The wording broader, now no longer contained to one deal, no longer anchored to a single decision. It had moved into territory that corporations understood instinctively: reputation risk, systemic instability, the kind of language that did not need explanation to trigger action. Across the gala room, the shift completed itself. Conversations no longer attempted to interpret, they moved directly into response. Phones pressed closer to faces, voices lowered into urgent clarity. Ethan stood at the center of that change, but no longer at the center of control. His posture remained straight, but the space around him had widened, not physically, but structurally. People were no longer orienting themselves toward him, they were orienting themselves toward the information, toward the signals that had already replaced him as the source of direction. Charles stepped beside him again, his voice calm, but edged with precision. We need immediate containment strategy, he said, though even as the words left him, they felt outdated. Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the scrolling data across his screen, as if searching for something stable, something that had not yet shifted. There is no containment, he said finally, his voice low, controlled, but stripped of denial. There is only response, and the distinction landed because it acknowledged what everyone else had already begun to understand. Containment belonged to moments that had not yet been defined. This one had already crossed that threshold. A man across the room spoke next, his tone analytical, but firm. Secondary markets are reacting ahead of public confirmation. He said they are pricing in long-term instability, not short-term disruption, and that difference echoed through the space, because long-term instability meant something deeper, something that could not be corrected with statements or reassurances. It meant trust had been recalculated. The junior analyst stood still, absorbing the language, the tone, the structure of how quickly perception had transformed into measurable consequence. She looked down at her tablet once more, not because she needed to verify anything, but because she was witnessing in real time how information became action, how action became outcome, and how outcome reshaped everything around it. The woman near the window spoke again, her voice quieter now, but more certain. This is no longer about them, she said. It is about everyone connected to them. And the room understood immediately, because connections were currency in spaces like this. And when one node shifted, the entire network adjusted accordingly. Outside the building, the city remained unchanged. Traffic lights, cycling pedestrians, moving, unaware that somewhere above them billions in projected value had already dissolved, not in chaos, not in spectacle, but in quiet, precise sequence. Back in the office, Darius watched the third wave form, not through headlines, but through alignment of behavior. Analysts began adjusting their models, projections, shifting language, tightening risk ratings. Recalibrated not as reaction, but as recognition of a pattern now fully visible. Carla stepped closer, her attention fixed on the screen. External confirmations are increasing, she said. Independent analysts are now referencing the audit findings directly, not as speculation, but as verified data. Darius nodded once, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, because this stage did not require intervention, it required observation. The system was functioning exactly as it was built to function. Information moving through the correct channels, reaching the correct nodes, triggering the correct responses, and in that precision, there was no need for amplification, only continuity. A notification appeared marked high priority, internal board communication. Whitmore Holdings emergency session initiated. Darius glanced at it briefly, then returned his attention to the broader pattern, because internal responses, while significant, were no longer central. The shift had already moved beyond them into the network that determined real outcomes. Carla studied him for a moment, then asked quietly, "Do you expect direct outreach?" He did not answer immediately, not because he needed time to think, but because the answer was already structured within the situation. "They will attempt it," he said finally, "but not because they believe it will change anything, because they need to show that they tried." And the clarity of that statement removed any illusion about what came next. Outreach would not be about resolution, it would be about record, about demonstrating effort within a system that had already moved past negotiation. Inside the gala room, Charles turned away from Ethan, stepping slightly toward a smaller group, his voice measured, deliberate. "We need to separate operational continuity from reputational exposure," he said, and the phrasing revealed a shift in strategy, no longer trying to restore what was lost, but attempting to preserve what remained. A man in the group nodded quickly. "We can isolate certain divisions," he said, "create distance between this event and ongoing operations." But another voice cut in immediately. "That distance will not hold. The data is already linked. The audit findings connect across multiple layers." And again, the pattern emerged. Every attempt to isolate was countered by the reality of connection, because systems at this level did not allow clean separation. Once information had integrated across them, Ethan remained where he was, his phone still in his hand, but no longer the center of his attention. His gaze moved across the room, taking in the repositioning, the recalibration, the subtle but undeniable shift in how people interacted with him and with each other. And in that observation, something settled, not acceptance, not resignation, but understanding. This was not a moment he could recover. This was a moment that had revealed something fundamental, something that had always existed, but had never been forced into visibility until now. He exhaled slowly, then looked up, his voice steady but different. "We focus on structural recovery," he said, "not immediate correction, long-term stabilization." And the language matched the reality, because short-term solutions no longer applied. A woman across from him nodded once. "That is the only path left," she said, and the simplicity of her response confirmed what the room had already concluded. The situation had moved beyond reaction into reconstruction. Back in the office, Darius stepped away from the screens for a moment, moving toward the window, the city below, continuing its rhythm unchanged in appearance, but subtly altered in structure, because within its networks, within its systems, within its flow of capital and decision, making a shift had occurred, one that would not be visible to the casual observer, but would be understood by those who knew where to look. He stood there quietly, his reflection faint against the glass, the stain still present, still visible, but now completely integrated into the sequence of the evening, not an interruption, not an anomaly, but a catalyst that had revealed the structure beneath the surface. His phone remained silent now, not because activity had stopped, but because it no longer required constant confirmation. The process had reached a stage where continuation was assumed, where the system moved forward on its own path, shaped by the very patterns it had exposed. And as he turned back toward the room, the screen still active, the data still flowing, the structure still responding, there was no sense of completion, only continuation, because what had happened was not an ending, it was a transition from one state to another. And within that transition, the only thing that remained constant was the understanding that power is not measured by how loudly it reacts, but by how completely it reshapes everything once it has been revealed. And in that quiet, controlled space far above the city, Darius Cole stood not as someone who had taken something away, but as someone who had allowed the system to show exactly what it was always capable of becoming when left unchecked and then corrected without hesitation. By the time the third cycle of updates stabilized, the shift was no longer a reaction, it was a new baseline across networks, across firms, across every system that had touched the original structure. The language had changed completely, no longer sudden, no longer unexpected. Now it was described as recalibration, as correction, as a necessary adjustment to maintain long-term integrity, and that change in language mattered because it signaled acceptance. The market was no longer asking what happened, it was adapting to what had already been defined. Inside the gala room, the transformation had reached its quietest stage, not loud, not chaotic, but settled. Conversations no longer carried urgency, they carried strategy. People no longer asked if the situation could be reversed, they asked how to move within the new reality, and that distinction marked the final transition from event to consequence. Ethan stood near the edge of the room, no longer attempting to direct anything, his posture composed, his expression controlled, but now aligned with the structure rather than resisting it. He watched as small groups formed and reformed around new priorities, around new alignments, around new calculations of risk and opportunity. And in that observation, something settled fully, not regret, not frustration, but understanding that the moment had not taken something from him, it had revealed something about the system he had been operating within. Charles remained nearby, his presence steady but quieter than before, his focus no longer on immediate response, but on long-term positioning. We will need to rebuild from foundation, he said, not as a suggestion, but as a recognition, and Ethan nodded once, because there was no alternative. Foundation once exposed could not be ignored, it had to be restructured entirely. Across the room, the junior analyst closed her tablet for the first time since the shift began, not because the information had stopped, but because she no longer needed to track it externally. She could see it in the room, in the way people spoke, in the way they listened, in the way they repositioned themselves without instruction, and that realization stayed with her, because it was not about data, it was about awareness, about how quickly perception could change when confronted with something real, something undeniable. The woman near the window stood slowly, her gaze moving once more across the space where Darius had been earlier, the absence now carrying more weight than the presence had before, because it represented a standard that had been revealed, and once revealed could not be unseen. She adjusted her jacket slightly, then stepped away from the table, not in avoidance, but in alignment, because the room itself had changed, and remaining static was no longer an option. Outside the building, the city continued its rhythm unchanged on the surface, but beneath that surface, the systems that moved capital, that directed influence, that shaped outcomes had already absorbed the shift. The numbers had adjusted, the relationships had recalibrated, the expectations had been rewritten, and none of it required spectacle, none of it required explanation, because the structure itself carried the meaning back. In the office, Darius stood at the center of that structure, not elevated, not removed, but positioned exactly where the system converged. The screens in front of him no longer showing rapid change, but steady flow, the kind that followed once alignment had been achieved. Carla reviewed the final set of updates, her voice calm, precise. The stabilization phase has begun, she said. External responses are consistent. There are no anomalies in the data. Darius nodded once, not because he needed confirmation, but because he recognized the pattern. The sequence had completed its initial cycle, and what remained was continuation, the natural progression of a system that had been corrected at its core. Any remaining exposure, he asked. Minimal, she replied. Most entities have already adjusted their positions. The ones that have not are no longer central to the structure. And again, the clarity of the response reflected the reality. The system had not just reacted, it had refined itself, removing instability, reinforcing alignment, creating a new baseline that would hold moving forward. Darius stepped toward the window, once more the city stretching out beneath him, unchanged in appearance, but fundamentally altered in structure, because somewhere within its networks a line had been drawn, not visibly, not publicly, but definitively aligned between assumption and reality, between perception and truth, between surface and substance. His reflection in the glass remained steady, the stains still present, still visible, but now completely neutral, no longer carrying any narrative beyond its place in the sequence. It had been part of the moment that revealed everything, and now it remained as a reminder, not of the action itself, but of the clarity that followed. His phone remained silent, not because activity had stopped, but because the system no longer required his direct input. The direction had been set, the structure had responded, and now it moved forward on its own path, shaped by the patterns it had exposed and corrected. Inside the gala room, the final stage of the evening settled into place. People began to leave, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with intention, each departure carrying a quiet acknowledgement that the room they had entered no longer existed in the same form. The conversations they would carry forward, the decisions they would make, the alignments they would choose, all shaped by what they had witnessed, not the surface of it, not the wine, not the words, but the underlying truth that had been revealed through it. Ethan remained until nearly the end, not because he needed to, but because leaving too quickly would suggest avoidance, and he understood now that avoidance was part of the pattern that had led to this moment. When he finally moved, it was with the same controlled pace he had maintained throughout the night, but now that control was different. It was not about dominance, it was about awareness. He paused briefly near the table, where everything had begun, his gaze resting on the surface, not searching, not questioning, simply acknowledging the point where assumption had met consequence. And then he turned and walked away, not chased, not followed, but changed in a way that did not require anyone else to confirm it. And far above, in a quiet office overlooking the same city, Darius Cole remained exactly where he had always been, not reacting, not explaining, not correcting, simply holding position as the system around him completed its adjustment. Because what had happened was never about proving anything, it was about revealing something that had always been there, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored, and once revealed, it did not need to be defended. It only needed to exist, because existence at that level carried its own authority, its own clarity, its own undeniable weight. And in that clarity, the outcome was not just accepted, it was understood as inevitable. 3 months later, the city still moved the same way it always had: lights, shifting traffic flowing, decisions being made in rooms that most people would never see. But inside those rooms, something had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, the kind of change that does not announce itself, because it no longer needs to, the kind that becomes part of the system itself, woven into the way people think, the way they act, the way they choose before they even realize they are choosing it. Whitmore Holdings, the glass tower, still stood tall, its reflection still cutting clean lines across the skyline. But inside, the structure had been rebuilt, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. Departments reorganized, leadership adjusted, protocols rewritten, not as reaction, but as correction. Every decision now filtered through a layer that had not existed before: awareness, not just of risk, not just of exposure, but of perception. And how quickly perception could become consequence. Ethan Whitmore no longer moved through rooms the same way he once had. His presence still recognized, his name still carried weight, but the way he carried himself had shifted, subtle but unmistakable, no longer assuming alignment, no longer expecting silence to work in his favor. He listened more, spoke less, measured interactions not for dominance, but for impact, because he had learned something that could not be unlearned, that power was not confirmed by how others responded to him, but by how quickly it could be removed. When he misjudged the room, Charles Whitmore had taken a different path, his focus no longer on expansion at any cost, but on stabilization, on rebuilding trust, not through statements, but through structure. Independent audits made public, accountability embedded into operations, not as a feature, but as a requirement the company did not recover quickly because recovery at that level was not about speed, it was about credibility, and credibility required consistency over time, not just correction in a single moment across the industry. The ripple had not faded. It had integrated firms adjusted their own internal protocols, reviewing patterns that had once been ignored, reclassifying what counted as minor, what counted as acceptable, what counted as risk, because the lesson had not been limited to one company or one event. It had extended outward into every system connected to it, into every room where assumptions were made without verification, into every table where silence had once been mistaken for agreement. The junior analyst who had stood at the edge of that moment now worked in a different division. Her role expanded, her perspective sharpened, not because of a promotion alone, but because she had witnessed something that could not be taught in training sessions or written in reports. She had seen how quickly everything could shift when one person refused to accept the narrative being placed on them and instead allowed the system to reveal itself, and that understanding guided her decisions in ways she did not always articulate but always applied. The woman who had spoken about silence became known for something else entirely. Her voice no longer quiet, no longer hesitant. She did not raise it, she did not force it, but when she spoke, people listened. Because they recognized that she had been one of the first to see the shift before it became obvious, and that kind of awareness carried its own authority. Back in the office, overlooking the city, Darius Cole stood in the same space, unchanged, not because nothing had happened, but because everything that had happened had already been accounted for, integrated into the structure of how he moved, how he decided, how he positioned himself within systems that responded to clarity, not noise. The stain from that night no longer marked his shirt, but it had never really been about the fabric. It had been about the moment, and the moment had long since been absorbed into the pattern of his work, his decisions, his presence. Carla stepped into the office, her movements as precise as ever. The quarterly reports are complete, she said, placing the data on the screen. Growth has exceeded projections across all secondary channels. The reallocation strategy performed above expectation. Darius reviewed the numbers quickly, not searching for validation, but for alignment. And the external response, he asked. Stable, she replied. No residual volatility, no lingering exposure. The system has fully adjusted. He nodded once, not as approval, but as confirmation, because that was the outcome he had anticipated from the beginning. Not chaos, not collapse, but correction, a shift that would redistribute rather than destroy, refine rather than disrupt. He moved toward the window, the same skyline stretching beneath him, the same patterns of light, the same movement of a city that never paused for individual moments. And yet within that movement something had changed, something that would not be visible to most, but would be understood by those who had been in that room, or those who had studied what followed, because the lesson was not about the incident, it was about the structure behind it, about what happens when assumption meets reality without preparation, about what happens when silence is mistaken for absence rather than control. His reflection in the glass remained steady, clear, unchanged, and in that reflection there was no need for adjustment, no need for reaction, only continuation, because what he had done was not extraordinary. It was precise. He had not raised his voice, he had not demanded recognition, he had not corrected anyone in the moment. He had simply allowed the system to reveal itself, and then responded to what was revealed with clarity, with control, with finality. His phone remained silent, the screens behind him steady, the data flowing in consistent patterns, the system no longer reacting, but operating within its new alignment. And in that quiet there was a kind of certainty that did not need reinforcement, a kind of authority that did not depend on acknowledgement, because it had already been established at the only level that mattered, the level where decisions became outcomes and outcomes became structure. He turned slightly away from the window, not because there was nothing left to see, but because there was nothing left to confirm. Everything that needed to be understood had already been revealed, and everything that followed was simply the continuation of that understanding, moving forward through systems, through people, through decisions that would now carry a different awareness whether they recognized it or not. And in that moment the final truth of what had happened settled, not as a conclusion, but as a constant, not something tied to a single night or a single room, but something that would exist in every space where power and perception intersected. You do not need to announce who you are when the system already knows. You do not need to defend your position when the structure already supports it. And you do not need to react when the moment itself is already doing the work of revealing everything that others failed to see until it was too late.